Marvel movies are insanely popular, and while the studio has some of the best people in the business working for them, their movies are not just well known for their high production value, but also for their many continuity and editing errors. While some are so small they are barely noticeable, others are blatantly obvious, and in today's video, we are counting down 10 of the worst mistakes that slipped through editing in popular Marvel movies. While small errors are easy to miss, there will always be viewers who will find every last detail that is wrong in a movie, and once you've noticed it, it is hard to unsee. After the team has saved the world from an alien invasion and sent Loki back to Asgard at the end of the Avengers, Steve Rogers gets onto his motorcycle and rides off into the sunset. Strangely enough, the elements don't seem to affect him, as his jacket and his perfect hair barely move, despite the background suggesting that Rogers is driving at a moderate speed. Perhaps he used some insanely powerful hair gel that not only keeps his hair in place, but also has protective powers that make a helmet redundant. Or, and this is probably more likely, Chris Evans simply sat on a stationary bike in front of a green screen, and the moving background was added in post-production in order to avoid Evans potentially receiving any injuries by actually driving a real motorcycle. About an hour into Avengers Infinity War, Captain America, Vision, and the others are arriving in Wakanda, where the weather seems to be as arbitrary as is New York. When the group arrives and T'Challa welcomes them, we can see the sunlight on his shoulder from the back, but it is gone when the perspective changes. Similarly, you can notice the sun appearing and disappearing throughout the battle later on in the movie, and you can even see the sky changing from being darkened by thick gray clouds to being only partially cloudy with a little sunshine. There are some mistakes that most people won't notice, and this particular mistake has been made by numerous movie makers and been ignored by so many editors that you almost have to let it slide. Take Iron Man for instance. In one of the first scenes in the movie, Tony Stark shows off his Jericho missile by launching it into the desert. We hear the enormous blast just before we see it, and while you may not have paid much attention to this, it is actually physically impossible because light travels faster than sound.
For your consideration, the Jericho.
Marvel Studios have made this mistake in many of their movies, with Thor's hammer usually causing a sonic boom that we can see and hear at exactly the same time, regardless of how far away the God of Thunder is. This is true for most explosions in the movies, and we can also hear all the explosions and laser blasts in the Guardians of the Galaxy movies, despite the fact that sound does not travel in space. Marvel aren't the only ones defying physics like that, however, as nearly every sci-fi film or series has made this mistake, with the exception of Firefly. For her very first scene in the Avengers, writer-director Joss Whedon wanted to make Natasha Romanoff, aka Black Widow, look like a total badass right off the bat. Audiences were supposed to see right away that this woman is capable of fighting alongside a genetically enhanced super soldier, an infinitely strong giant green monster, and the literal Norse god of thunder. So in her introduction scene, she instantly beats up 3 gangsters while tied to a chair. And while all her moves and kicks are quite impressive, the most memorable moment is definitely when she swings back her head as if meaning to headbutt one of the men, and instead knocks him out with a gentle brush of her hair. In reality, this was probably just a matter of the stuntman standing too far away and no one noticing, but since it made the final cut, one could assume that Black Widow also has deadly hair. In Captain America Winter Soldier, Steve Rogers visits an exhibition dedicated to his life. Part of the exhibition is an entry about James Buchanan Barnes, aka Bucky, who is now the Winter Soldier. But if you pay close attention, you will notice that something doesn't quite add up here. The text about Barnes begins by saying that he was born in 1916 as the oldest child of 4. However, by the end of the text, the year of his birth has somehow changed, and it now says that he lived from 1917 to 1944. In Iron Man 2, Tony Stark has to appear in front of the United States Senate Armed Services Committee to testify. Later on, he re-watches the video of his testimony on YouTube, but there's a pretty embarrassing mistake in this scene. The video he watches is entitled Stark Industries CEO Tony Stark on Capitol Hill, only they have misspelled capital with an A instead of an O. Since the video was uploaded by C-SPAN, the cable satellite public affairs network, which covers the political goings-on in Washington, D.C., you would expect them to spell the name correctly, seeing as Capitol Hill is also where their headquarters are based. We already mentioned Avengers Infinity War twice, but this movie had a lot of mistakes, so here we go again. Following the ship's departure in the beginning of the movie, Spider-Man is clinging to its outside in order to save the captured Doctor Strange. However, he soon notices that the air is getting thinner and thinner, and it is only when Tony Stark, aka Iron Man, comes to his rescue and gives him a new suit that Spider-Man can breathe again. This new suit has some pretty nice new gadgets, of course, but what we want to focus on is the fact that the suit looks slightly different later on in the movie. The spider on the chest actually changes its color and turns from blue to black, although this might just be due to different lighting, and it is so minor it is hardly noticeable. Towards the end of Ant-Man, the team sneaks into Darren Cross's building, but they are caught soon enough. After a brief fight, Cross puts a gun to Scott Lang's head and gets ready to pull the trigger, but Scott saves himself by summoning his army of ants to block the gun's hammer, thus preventing Cross from being able to fire the gun. The fact that Cross should have noticed that there are at least 5 huge ants crawling all over the gun he's holding upright in front of his face is one thing, but even if you ignore that, there's still one thing that doesn't add up. Until this moment, the entire scene showed that everyone was using Glocks, which don't have an external hammer. Obviously, not everyone is familiar enough with guns to know this, but even if you don't know anything about guns, you will notice that there were no hammers in any of the shots of the guns before this close-up. So based on everything shown before this close-up, Scott would have been shot long before he realized that his ants wouldn't be able to save him. You surely remember the turning point of Iron Man when Obadiah Stane uses a device on Tony Stark that causes him to be completely paralyzed for a short period of time.
Tony? Tony, are you there? Hello?
Breathe.
And you might also recall that the device has the effect of causing Tony to bleed from the ears as well, which typically indicates a severely ruptured eardrum or a brain hemorrhage. Either way, it seems like something that Tony should definitely be concerned about, but for some reason, he appears to have miraculously healed between this scene and the next, where the blood is completely gone as he crawls to his garage to retrieve his old arc reactor. It seems a little unlikely that Tony would have taken the time to clean himself up while he's close to dying and crawling across his house to save his life. But even though it seems like an incredibly big detail to go unnoticed by editors, most of the audience missed it too, so you can't really blame them. As mentioned earlier, physics isn't exactly Marvel Studios' strong suit, and even though they tried their best to use real science to explain powers in Ant-Man, instead of keeping it vague, it unfortunately backfired. Twice, viewers are informed about how Hank Pym's particles work and learn that they shrink or enlarge the space in between atoms rather than the atoms themselves, and that this process therefore doesn't have any effect on the weight of whatever or whoever is changed in size. The only problem with this explanation is that Marvel seems to conveniently forget about it whenever it seems fitting, so that Hank can carry a giant tank in his pocket, for example.
I'm not gonna die. Neither are you. It's not a keychain.
Or so Thomas the Tank Engine doesn't destroy half the house and the police car. And even weirder is the fact that Ant-Man is able to go subatomic.
This regulator is holding me
Do
back.
not screw with the regulator. If that regulator is compromised, you would go subatomic.
What does that mean?
Because it is obviously impossible to shrink the space between atoms to a point where something would become smaller than the atoms themselves, so this simply doesn't make any sense.